It's an honor and pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Joachim Krausse, who will give a lecture on Richard Buckminster Fuller, Frederick Kiesler, and Knut Holm. Joachim Krausse was professor for design theory at the University in Dessau, and he is known for his research on Buckminster Fuller and his translations of Buckminster Fuller's texts. He co-edited groundbreaking studies on Fuller. I just want to mention Your Private Sky. Our idea was for this panel in the afternoon to have the view from the outside. So to pair up Kiesler with those other positions. And Joachim Krausse will now give a lecture on Kiesler's relation to the entourage, let's call it entourage of Buckminster Fuller, and the structural study associates. Lemberg-Holm, for example, we have a kind of treasure for our research, the calendar diaries of Stephan Kiesler, and I think Knut Lemberg-Holm, or together with his wife, in many variations are the names that pop up the most in the whole diaries. So especially in the 30s. And that is, I think, the starting point of the lecture that we will hear now. So thank you for joining us back after the lunch break, and it is a pleasure and honor for me to have Joachim Krausse giving this lecture.
Hello. I would like to thank especially Gert for this wonderful introduction and also the invitation to this meeting. I'm really glad to be here and to speak to you as somebody who is not belonging to the Kiesler family or the tribe, the academic tribe of the Kieslerians. I'm a Fullerian. So, as you know, nobody is an island. And this is the point of departure to contract some relations that people have at a certain time. And I focus on the early years of Buckminster Fuller, and one can say the second phase of the development of Kiesler's work, and I would say the third period of Lönnberg-Holm's development. And as Gert mentioned, when I had the opportunity to work in the archive, the Kiesler archive, I was curious about was there any correspondence in in the early 1930s, late 1920s. No, there was no correspondence, but we found in the diary nearly every week the name Holm. And I knew that the name of Löhnberg-Holm, which is a little bit complicated and often misread and miswritten, was called by his friends Holm. And that is also the case with the diary of Cornelis van Eesteren of 1921-22, when he met Löhnberg-Holm in Germany, in Berlin mostly, and it couldn't be identified. The editor of this diary couldn't identify the Holm. So, and I said it is sure Knut Löhnberg-Holm because of that encounter in the early 20s came up a long ongoing friendship with Cornelis van Eesteren. So I show you some pictures. I hope I can make it very simple, just that we have the time to discuss some interesting questions. And first of all, I very quickly hope to introduce my protagonists, and I start with Buckminster Fuller, with the question, who is Buckminster Fuller? Because Buckminster Fuller is like Kiesler, or even more, not categorizable. He is not, that was very often mentioned, not really an architect. Philip Johnson was of that opinion. Buckminster Fuller, an architect? No, he is no architect. So he had no academic training. He was a self-made designer, and this makes clear some of the difficulties he had to enter this world of architectural design. So, he starts after a practice in the construction, commercial construction world, with a project to develop a completely new house in 1928, not 27. I come back to that question. It's always he himself said, I started in 27, but we find no documents that this is correct. So we see him here in the year 1928 in Chicago at Lake Michigan with his small family, and he is thrown out of the job and has time to care for the baby, and he is makes a diagram about the growth of the baby and so on. So he's terribly inspired by life. That is in the diary of his wife to be found. Bucky is terribly inspired by life. And now he wants to conceive a new house. We don't see the new house or sketches of a house in the beginning. And I found in the Buckminster Fuller archive the first sketches and the first texts of this project, which became the famous Dalmatian house. So we see the globe here, and in the corners you see the kind of personal coordinates of him. There is here we see the baby and the heart, the sun, the stars, and the globe with vertical structures. This is a sketch, and then we come to the drawing of that. It's not sharp, but never mind. We see a little bit modified the heart and the baby in one line, and the sun and the church. So it is the physical light and the metaphysical light, one can say. And in the middle is, as a reference, the earth. So it is not man in the middle. It is the human affair is the frame. It is not in the middle. So this is a first point of different thinking. In the middle is the earth, not a town, not a house. So, but the earth and the vertical structures you see here. This is a catalogue of vertical structures, be it natural or be it artificial. Here is the big Zeppelin that has a specific meaning for him. And here you see the electricity masts and the pagoda there. And here the huge tree. It is natural as well as technical. There's no difference. And here in that ring you see vertical constructions like the lighthouse, the high rise, and so on. A ship mast here, and in the inner ring here we have examples of everyday objects that gives that gives inspiration for the designing process, because it incorporates some principles, and therefore also here you find the tennis racket, and then the umbrella, the automobile. This is a suitcase, the airplane, a sailboat, the folding stool, and a bird. So these are the principles he is interested in, and has a closer look on this. Out of that come sketches of a central mast and suspended structure, but it is not clear what kind of ground floor would be fitting for such a construction. And then he comes to the first important step, no longer to use the square as the main geometry for building houses, but the hexagon. He proceeds to the hexagon. And out of this comes 2 years later, or one to 2 years later, the Dymaxion House. And I must say here that this enormous progress he made through a stage of sketches and early models. This is model number 3. And the aesthetics of the Dymaxion House is dependent of a very intense exchange of ideas with his friends at the time. In 1929, he is in contact with Knödel and Bergholm and Frederick Kiesler. And both of them, they were very much experienced in the aesthetic design. Fuller not. He had no experience in that. But with the help of my friends, you know, I can proceed and be successful. So, important for him, for finding this structure was a heritage he had beyond education, beyond academic academic knowledge and so on. And this heritage was double. It was a mental heritage, but also a physical, familiar connection to his great aunt Margaret Fuller, who belonged to the circle of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and we know from letters he wrote to his sister and so on, that Buckminster Fuller, exactly in that time, 1928, when he conceived the Dymaxion House, he was discovering his great aunt and her role in mid-19th century as the most important discussion partner of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he studied and read the texts of Ralph Waldo Emerson. So it is quite clear Buckminster Fuller's tradition is that of American transcendentalism and nothing else, you know. So, and even in the case of poetical pictures of thinking, he is close to his great aunt Margaret, and therefore I cite this. There's in every creature a fountain of life, which, if not choked back by stones and other dead rubbish, will create a fresh atmosphere and bring to life fresh beauty. And it is the same with the nation and with the individual man. She writes that in the context of the discussion of an American culture, a genuine American culture, you know, how would that be possible? And here we can say the same, it's the same with the nation and with the individual man, and Bucky Fuller thought, and with the individual house. So it's exactly this figure, you know, of thinking that is something going up and then is slowly falling down, and he describes this wonderfully in these first papers I mentioned. He wrote the first drafts, and there he says, We will have arrived at our new artistic era of architectural expression when our buildings will have lost their last trace of feudalistic depression. When we arise in our buildings to gravity by means of mast or caisson, reaching out in space from the vertical by tension and compression, compression diminishing as we fall off from the vertical until we finally flow downward in direct tension. Then will our exteriors hanging from the outward flow in the top like a great fountain be full of livesomeness, light and color. And the first, he's thinking about a brand mark for his project here, and the first is neologism he finds that is lightful. We had that in this drawing around a circle around the earth where he writes lightful. So you can see that the inspiration here is a poetical one, interestingly. There, in his later work, another poetical image is decisive for his thinking, but I can't go into detail with that. But it's the expanding sphere that is another metaphorical expression that he takes literally and wants to model it. So exactly here with the Dymaxion house, it is the model he develops out of this image of the fountain of life. Yeah. A home like a person must as completely as possible be independent and self-supporting. Now comes this idea of a self-sufficient house. Beyond infrastructure. So, as a system that is self-regulating. That is his idea. I mean, it is not completely possible, but it is interesting as a heuristic imagination. So, and this self-supporting or self-containing, always it is self. It is about how can the materials, the construction be self-supporting. Yeah. That is his ideal, and that he wants to achieve. So here we see the hexagon construction around a mast, suspended. That is the first model. So it starts really with clearing the structure, and not with not with the ground floor. But the idea of this suspended structure, that is crucial. And then we have the ground floor, and it is intended to avoid massive construction. So the deck construction is a web, and it can be covered, with an elastic material, but by avoiding this massive construction of a deck, he's able to create an enormous lightweight construction. And he envisions a house that is not heavier than a car. And in the Wichita house, he really is coming to that point that this house weighs 3 tons. 3 tons. That is half a ton more than an SUV. You must imagine. Okay. So then he has, this comes through his readings and his reasonings about space and time. He comes to this solution of his hexagonal floor, that he also could give the measures from the center to the periphery, not in meters, but in time. Like the propagation of waves, that goes from the center to the periphery, takes some time. He thinks he can introduce a time measure into an architectural construction. And therefore he is designing this grid, which is not an orthogonal grid. So, I hope this is enough about Buckminster Fuller. It's just the origins of his thinking, and we can imagine that when he meets Kiesler in 1929, that there are 2 minds that have very much in common in their thinking, but completely different backgrounds, and that this exchange is really interesting and full of tensions also. Okay, I come to the next protagonist, Knut Lönnberg-Holm, who is not so well known as the others, or to make it more clear, he was completely forgotten for decades, and only in the late 1990s, Marc Dessources, he cared about his personal archive and wrote a first article about Shelter magazine. It was completely forgotten. Nobody referred to it. Knut Lönnberg-Holm, you may ask your classmates or colleagues, nobody knew him. Buckminster Fuller made a step in the early 60s, and he planned to write a book on his friend Knut Lönnberg-Holm. He announced that, but never did it. He was too busy to do that. But he honored him, and he said Knut Lönnberg-Holm is the most important modern architect. That he said in 1962, several times. So, why? Because this guy, he, like Kiesler, had built only one building in his younger years, a shipyard in Denmark, from where he comes, and then was not able to build, but what he did for most of the time was the editorial work of the world's most important building catalog, suites catalog, he became an information architect, and he became the inventor of the term information design in 1947. But I'm only referring here to his early development. We see him here short after his arrival in the US in late 1923, where he was in New York, Chicago, and then in Detroit. And in that time, arriving at an immigrant, a lonely immigrant, he made some very interesting photographs, and this is a story as such. You know, his photographs. He was no professional photographer, but he photographed in a very interesting way. He introduced this way of photographing skyscrapers, the Woolworth Building. It's one of a series of more than 20 photographs, and the usual way to photograph the skyscraper. Here on the right hand side you see the Woolworth Building in a publication of I think 1922 or so, where it was in use to only make shots in that way, without this perspective and it is called by Mendelssohn Schrägaufnahme, eine Schrägaufnahme. So and he gave a lot of his photos to Erich Mendelssohn, who visited in 1924 the US and also had a meeting with Knut Lönnberg-Holm. And Lönnberg-Holm gave him his photographs, and we see him in Mendelssohn's very famous book America, Bilderbuch eines Amerika, Bilderbuch eines Architekten, picture book of an architect. Yeah. In 1926 published, or one can say in December 1925 it was ready and sent by Mendelssohn to a lot of colleagues, friends, and so on, and was 4 times reprinted, and then in the last edition he had to he didn't mention Lönnberg-Holm in the first 4 printings, but then in the edition of 1928 he had to mention in an afterword, which I cite here, the photos of the architect Lönnberg-Holm, Detroit. You see that is a lot of pictures, and even this list is not complete. Yeah. So, but it's not only the quantity of these photographs that makes it a real critical thing for Mendelssohn's book. It is especially the quality of these photographs, but because these are the photographs that were mentioned in responses of the friends and colleagues of Mendelssohn, and it was always the photographs of Lönnberg-Holm that were found revolutionary and were taken for other publications and so on. But those friends, they knew Lundberg-Holm, but had no idea that he was the photographer of these pictures. So this is one, Mahoney Notch used it, and so on, and so on. What I want to show here is that this way of new seeing, we have that topic, Neues Sehen in the photography, you know, Neues Sehen. And Lundberg-Holm is absolutely the pioneer of Neues Sehen. This long exposure, what you have here, there's a second one, shows that in a long exposure, you have these stripes of light, you know, these stripes. And Mendelssohn, who made the book, was parallel involved in the design of Herpich and Söhne. This is a store, and he was in the middle of designing the facade. And then he developed this wonderful facade for the night, the night side of the building. That was really new, that Mendelssohn developed a day and a night version of the facade, and he developed this indirect lighting for getting such a stripe of light, indirect light. Neon was not in use at the time, was not yet invented in 1925, 26. This idea of having a trace form, you know, a trace form. Today, several times was mentioned the time and motion studies. Gilbreth is one of the pioneers of those light trace forms you get when, and this was Lundberg's Gilbreth invention with a chronocyclograph. You know, you have a light bulb here, and then you create movements, and the light trace form comes when you darken the picture of the camera, and you get those forms. So the stream is coming up here for the first time. And this is the day version of the facade, and Lundberg-Holm had a controversy with Mendelssohn about the use of the photographs, and his friend Cornelis van Eestern, he wrote to Mendelssohn that he should mention Lundberg-Holm as the author of these photographs. So not Lundberg-Holm directly, but his friend in Amsterdam, Cornelis van Eestern, did that, and he published some of the photographs and also of the reports of Lundberg-Holm. He gave him in several letters. Cornelis van Eestern published this in Dutch magazines and international magazines like here, America Reflections by Knut Lundberg-Holm. So here you see Theo van Doesburg, which was the friend of Kiesler, a close friend of Kiesler, one can say. On the left is Cornelis van Eesteren, both preparing the models for the famous exhibition in Paris, Les Architectes du Groupe de Style. Yes, Theo van Doesburg, Cornelis van Eesteren, Husser, Van Leusden, Oud, Rietveld, and Mies van der Rohe. Yeah, so, and in this exhibition, those famous designs were shown, which are mostly known as designs by Theo van Doesburg. But the designer of the structure is Cornelis van Eesteren. The coloring is from Theo van Doesburg. So Cornelis van Eesteren took party for Knud Lundberg-Holm because he himself had made this experience of not being mentioned as the designer, because Theo van Doesburg published some of those designs under his name, not mentioning Cornelis van Eesteren. Then, in later publications, he did. So that is one of the common experiences the two men had, Knud Lundberg-Holm and Cornelis van Eesteren. And therefore, he was so engaged in this case of the authorship of those photographs. So I only wanted to mention this. This is sometimes very important. Why are people close or not close? Because of their common experiences. You know. So, and here we have the design of Knud Lundberg-Holm, which made him well known in the scenery of modern architecture. It is his contribution to the competition of Chicago Tribune Tower that was published by all who wrote about this competition. What I show you here is Gropius, the Bauhaus book #1, because the designs of Lundberg-Holm were shown in his exhibition in '23 in Weimar in the Bauhaus, and this exhibition was called International Architecture, and so was called the first book, which came 2 years later, appeared 2 years later with Knud Lundberg-Holm. He was well known. He also was well known to Mahoney Nonch, who planned a book to make him in the Bauhaus book series. And for the Bauhaus people, when Gropius went to the US for the first time in 1928, he wanted from Mucha the address of Lundberg-Holm. Lundberg-Holm was their man in America. It was the person who you first are steering to. Yeah. So well known, but he emigrated, found no job in Europe, and emigrated in November 1923, and was completely forgotten. Here is the Walter Gropius International, the first Bauhaus book of 1925, and you see it's very, very similar to the poster Kiesler made in '24 for the International Theatre Exhibition. Okay, here we see Lundberg-Holm with his wife Ethel at the famous Bauhaus building in Dessau, when he was able to make a trip to Europe in 1931, exactly in the time when the discussions between Fuller, Kiesler, and him were very intense. So that we have in this development in the US two persons who were very, very good informed about the current development in Europe, Lundakholm and Kiesler. Kiesler went to Europe in 1930. I don't say very much, only these crates are really great because we can see his complete capital was in these crates. That was what he was transferring from Paris to New York in January of 1926 when he arrived in America. And it was the capital was his design of the international exhibition of new theater technique. So I don't give long comments to that without that this is a pure structural solution for an exhibition. The first exhibition system, I think, in order to not to use the walls for exhibiting pictures. So, and in a way, this is paradigmatic because it's a structure that is activating. Because if you put this in the middle of the room, then you activate the public to go around, to follow a certain way, and to have certain views. That is not necessary when you put the exhibits on the wall. So therefore, I think this is a really important step in design in general, and in defining space. And here here you see no trace forms. The trace forms are the result of putting those structures in a room. But later, these trace forms by a colleague of Lundakholm were really drawn. I don't have the picture here, but no, never mind. So short, his book of Kiesler's book of 1930 is a really very, very important document because it shows some common concepts he has with Buckminster Fuller when they meet, but the structure he's so proud of is City in Space. This is, yes, floating in space, but nobody knows how is really the construction. It's not clear, and he doesn't explain it. So he has that idea of tension and tensionism, but it is not concrete. How looks this suspension structure like? And so he's interested in paradigms. He's finding with suspended structures and reproduces in this book the solutions of Brothers Rush. The Brüder Rush in Germany, friends of Mies van der Rohe, had the same idea as Buckminster Fuller with his house on the mast. And then the Brothers Rush also are interested in natural principles of suspended construction. And here you have the spider net system. But here you can see Buckminster Fuller, therefore I have shown his solution of
of a deck network, that he develops an own geometry for making it really functional and not only following a natural example. So, and furthermore, Kiesler includes in this book the Zeiss Planetarium, which is, I think, more interesting than it has been seen in the recent years. I wrote 2 articles about the Zeiss Planetarium. It's for the first time that we have a completely resolution of the conventional construction with columns and beams, resolved everything into a network, a network completely triangulated. This invention of 1922, the Zeiss Planetarium, is of Bauersfeld, and it is a double invention. And the invention is first the projector, that the starry sky has to be projected on a screen, and he has to build the screen. The projector itself is constructed in the first step by dividing the sphere by great circles. It is exactly the method Buckminster Fuller later employs for his geodesic domes. Dividing the sphere into great circles, and that method, Bauersfeld, transfers to the construction of the screen and comes to this kind of network. Okay, this is a too big story, but I only wanted to mention that. Lönnberg-Holm now is interested in all those structures above the buildings, like antennae and things like that. So, on one of his photographs, and this is very interesting. It's left is a photo of Lönnberg-Holm he sent to Cornelis van Eestern, and showing a scaffolding system which was just invented of tubular steel as we use it today for constructions. And on the right-hand side, the same object, and I think of the same photographic series, is printed in Kiesler's book of 1930. And this is the germ of an idea to construct the Woodstock Theatre out of such a tubular system, suspended, demountable, and it is people were crazy about that design, not executed, unfortunately. Otherwise, if it would have been executed, I am sure that Frederick Kiesler would have become an architect only. Okay, I think I stop here. It's going much more, but I think I stop here. I only wanted to show you in some details that we can see how intense this exchange in that constellation was, and that out of that came the demand for have a kind of institution to further discuss these things, and therefore they founded the study structural study associates, including other people, especially from the architectural record, where he later publishes, and also Lindbergh-Holm publishes. And Lindbergh-Holm is a man at that time of the architectural record, and then in the same publishing house switches to the building catalog, suites catalog. But before, he writes very interesting essays about fundamental questions of modern architecture, like lighting, for instance, acoustics, and so on. So, thank you.